universally. Whether we're talking about the indigenous people of the high deserts of the Americas, through the Yucatan, in southern Mexico, or into the Andes of Bolivia and Peru, all through the Sinai traditions and the Coptic traditions and the pre-Christian traditions, the Buddhist and Tibetan traditions, they all say that we are part of all that we see, that we are deeply connected to our bodies, we're deeply connected to the world, and that we have the ability to influence, and this is important, not to control, not to manipulate, but we have the ability to influence the outcome of events in our lives, in our communities, in our families, and in our world. And they apply those principles in what to us look like miraculous forms of healing, for example. We've seen examples of this through the medicineless hospitals in Tibet and through the healers in the Andes. What looks like miraculous disappearance of tumors, for example. Some are visible outside the body, some inside the body, in a matter of hours. And to modern science, because we're conditioned to believe that we're separate from our world, there's nothing that allows for that connection and that influence, so to us we call it a miracle. It's only a miracle until we understand the connection, and then it becomes a technology. What they found is that there is a connection between our heart and our brain. They learned the techniques to manage and create effects in their bodies, in the world around them. And when we look into the laboratory, it parallels very closely what our own scientists are finding now. And intuitively, what we all know, positive emotions, such as care, gratitude, appreciation, compassion, those kinds of emotions in our bodies set up a conversation between our heart and our brain. It's a two-way conversation. And when that conversation is optimum, we call it coherence, optimum coherence. Coherence can be measured with conventional equipment. Electrical and magnetic energy between the heart and the brain can be measured. Optimum coherence is a very low frequency, 0.10 hertz. The fundamental heartbeat of the earth is 7.8 hertz. So the fundamental coherence, the optimum coherence between our heart and our brain is less than one of the, it's the signals that whales communicate with, actually, and military submarines to some degree. That's why it's a problem for the whales. So it's a really low frequency that we set up between our heart and our brain. When I was in school, many of our listeners, I know when they were in school, in the young people today, we were taught that the brain is the master organ in the body. We know the brain's important, but the brain is not the master organ. It receives its signals from the heart. And there's a reluctance to teach that in our classrooms today. But the quality of the feelings in the heart are what send the signal and trigger the brain to release whatever chemistry it releases into the bodies. Our ancestors knew that. Now, I'm not saying they knew it from a scientific perspective or used the word coherence, but they knew how to incorporate these relationships into what we would call prayer, for example. I had an experience here in northern New Mexico in the early 1990s. I write about in a couple of the books. A native friend of mine asked me if I wanted to join him during one of the worst droughts in the history of the Southwest in a prayer of rain. And I had an expectation. I said, sure. I had an expectation. I thought I would see some native dancing and chanting and something like that. So I met my friend. We walked through over 100,000 acres of the most beautiful high desert sage into an ancient stone circle that he said it's so old, no one knows who built it, but he said the stones are right where his ancestors placed these stones in a time before anyone knows. And my friend's name was David. I watched David. He sat down, he took his old work boots off, he stepped naked feet into this stone circle. And I wasn't prepared for what I saw next. He closed his eyes, he turned his back to me, held his hands in a prayer mudra for just a few seconds. And then he said, I'm hungry. You want to go get a bite to eat? And I said, yeah, but I thought you were going to pray for rain. And he looked right at me and he said, no. He said, if I prayed for rain, rain could never happen. Because the moment you pray for something to happen. You've just acknowledged it doesn't exist, and you may be empowering the very condition you're hoping to change. I said, if you didn't pray for rain just now, what did you just do? He said, when I closed my eyes, he said, I felt the feeling of what it feels like when it rains. He says, I felt the feeling of my naked feet in the mud of our Pueblo village, and the mud's there because we've had so much rain. And he said, I smelled the smells of what it smells like when the rain falls off the earthen walls of our Pueblo homes. He incorporated his physical senses into the prayer as if what he wanted to experience was already present. He was giving thanks for the rain that was already there. Now, I can't prove this scientifically. We went to town, to Taos, New Mexico. We had a bite to eat, and by the time I got back to my home that evening, something was happening that I hadn't seen, no one had for a long time. Big black clouds were moving in over the mountains, and it started to rain that night. And it rained and rained and rained. It rained all night, it rained all morning, it rained all afternoon. The next day it rained, the roads were washed out, cattle were stranded, crops were flooded. It rained so much there was no place for the rain to go. And I called my friend David on the phone, and I said, what's going on? What's this all about? And he was quiet just for a minute, and he kind of chuckled. He said, that's the part of the prayer that the elders could never figure out. He said they could bring the rain, they couldn't tell it how long to rain or how much rain to have. So there's a difference between asking for something to happen and working toward that outcome and praying for it to happen and claiming it and feeling as if it already exists. It's a subtle and powerful difference, in quantum physics apparently makes all the difference in the world. It is the ability to incorporate all of the physical senses, knowing that we're part of the world, not separate from it, and feel what we would like to experience so that it can happen, rather than asking for it to come, acknowledging that it's not there. That is a subtle and powerful difference, and it's something I find almost universally in the ancient traditions. And we spent time in the Coptic monasteries in the Egyptian desert, for example, with the shaman in the Andes of Bolivia and Peru. We see exactly, they use different language, they see exactly the same thing. If they want something to occur, if they want a healing to occur, they come from the place that that healing has already happened. And that is an example of almost a unified, uniform wisdom that our ancestors had. And when we began to feel separate from the world, we were told that we were powerless. And the false science tells us that. It says, we're random beings, life is random, we're separate from our bodies, we're separate and powerless in our world. And so we're conditioned to feel helpless in the world. And it's one of the places I think there's a lot that can be learned from our indigenous ancestors.